Gentlemen, when you have finally passed the port for the last time, I wonder if I might regale you with a tale set within the confines of these very walls, which I have compiled from a series of diaries found in the attic of the house. Whitminster has a Bluebeard's chamberer, a jack-in-the-box, if you will, awaiting some future occupant of the house. The Diary of Dr. Ashton, December the 13th, 1730. Dr. and Mrs. Ashton had no children of their own, and had taken into their care a young orphan boy by the name of Frank. More recently, they had also taken in the son of an old friend, the Earl of Kildonan, who was travelling overseas. The boy's father felt him unfit to make the voyage. "Not that he is sickly," the Earl wrote, "but that he is given to moping about in our raths and graveyards, and he brings home romances that fright my servants out of their wits." It was a Friday, and Mrs. Ashton's black cockerel had gone missing. She sent the boys to look for it, but all that could be recovered were a few black, charred feathers. Abominable! Abominable!
Keep them off! Keep them off! Oh, help me! Help me! Keep them off!
Dr. Ashton, having his suspicions, questioned Saul, who explained that young Frank had taken fright from a game they had both been playing. That night, Dr. and Mrs. Ashton sat at Frank's side. A sickness, a fever had taken hold of him.
"I am afraid for my Lord Saul. I am afraid he will be very cold. I am free of them now. Oh, I am sorry about your black cockerel, Mrs. Ashton, but he said we must use it so if we were to see all that could be seen."
Whatever had taken Frank had come back for Lord Saul. Judging from later entries, Dr. and Mrs. Ashton lived on undisturbed into their old age, for there are no further records of anything out of the ordinary. Over 70 years had passed, and the house welcomed in its new residents. Dr. Olds, his niece Mary, their housekeeper Mrs. Maple, and various servants in her charge. Mrs. Maple was having a terrible problem with a sawfly infestation in the room adjoining the doctor's.
So many sawflies! Such terrors!
During her cleaning of the house, she found an unusual glass tablet, which the good doctor thought might be of interest to Mary. She duly studied it, but was not prepared for what she saw next. Mary could not believe her eyes, yet could not tear them away. The only way in which she could calm her nerves was to record her experience in her journal for a good friend of hers.
My dearest Emily, my hand is trembling as I write this, but I must keep record of it. Do not ask me how, what I saw. It was in a glass tablet found on the grounds. I found myself transfixed, mesmerised, as a vision appeared before me in the glass. I saw 2 boys in the grounds of the house. An old crone, she put something glittering in the youngest hand, the same glass tablet, and gave instructions to something terrible. And then, in the view from my very bedroom window, I saw a sacrifice. Blood and burned feathers on the ground. The eldest, a pale youth, it was horrible. He called them and they came for him. Hideous creatures, crouching low at first and then swift like hounds from hell. The pale boy ran to the door of this very house, and these creatures, they tore the flesh from his skin. My dear Emily, by some terrible miracle, I have been the unwilling witness to some episode of tragedy connected to this very house.
Later that night, Dr. Olds had finished in his study and was heading for his bedroom. It was pitch black, and his room was the farthest away. He passed through the hallway and found himself outside the infested room. The door was open, and he could hear something rustling in the dark. Dr. Olds wouldn't tell Mary what had happened to him. His only words were, "Tomorrow! Tomorrow!" She put him to bed and then made her way back to her own room, where she slept uneasily, plagued by terrible dreams. The next day, another attempt was made to clear out the infested room. The doctor still would not say what had happened to him in the night. In the daytime it was a very well-lit room, though perhaps not a very airy one. The principal piece of furniture was a gaunt old press of dark wood, locked, and incidentally the resting place of the papers from which I have distilled my tale.
Mrs. Maple? Mrs. Maple?
Dr. Olds called for Mrs. Maple and asked for the keys with which to unlock the press.
Oh, bless my... No, that was that...
Mrs. Maple spoke at great length, a habit of hers, about the house's previous occupants, and of how Lord Saul, to whom the press and contents had belonged, had met his somewhat macabre end. For one so young, he had quite a mysterious reputation, being often seen to creep about at night, peering in at the windows. It was believed he was not alone. It was whispered, and it still is, that on lonely winter nights, when the fires blaze, his lonely, thin ghost flutters at the windows.
100 years or more ago, and that was in the time of Dr. Ashton. He was a very fine gentleman.
Mrs. Maple's meandering train of thought having finally allowed her to recall the resting place of the keys, the decision was made to move Lord Saul's last remaining possessions to the attic, where they were shut up, never to be exhumed. Until now, that is. Whitminster does indeed have a Bluebeard's chamber, a jack-in-the-box, awaiting some future occupant of the house. What is that? Tapping, rustling at the glass.
I see it.
What on earth?
I see it at the window. James is perfectly correct.
Frank! Oh, I fancy it's real. Good Lord!
I'm so cold. So very cold.
Them that was with him would strip the skin, leaving an ugly, thin ghost.